Father in heaven, I'm thankful for my friends, and I'm thankful that, Lord, they would be willing to come and gather this Friday evening to learn about the book of Ruth. And we're thankful for the men and women of our church, and we're thankful that, God, you have called them to yourself and put a desire in their heart that they would grow to know you more and to walk with you and to know what it means to live a life that's centered on your word. And so, God, I pray that as we look at Ruth, you would really help us to be blessed. And as we study it, that you would not only increase our knowledge, although we do really ask for your help in knowing more of your scriptures, but it would ignite our affections and our desires for you, God. So bless us, Lord, as we study Ruth 1 today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Now, just as a opening, who has read the book of Ruth before? Has anyone? Okay. Okay. So most of you have read it before. Yeah. Ruth, of course, it's a beautiful story. It's short, right? 4 chapters long. And there's no book like the book of Ruth in the Bible. It's so unique. And one of the things that's so unique about the book of Ruth is that there's really a total absence of anything bad, right? There's really nothing evil in the story. There's no violence, no horror, no malice or anything like that. And somebody one time brought up this point. I think it's a beautiful point. They said, there's this verse in Philippians 4, and this is what it says. Paul writes in Philippians 4, verse 8, he says, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things." And then that person went on to say that if you really do think about these things, you will think about the book of Ruth. Because the book of Ruth is true and honorable and just and pure and lovely and commendable and excellent and worthy of praise. Now, the book of Ruth, it's not unfortunate, but the book of Ruth often is deemed to be, a book that should be studied and cherished by women. And it certainly is. I've shared this at the Sunday school before, but when you look at the book of Ruth in our English Bibles, it comes after the book of Judges. But in the Hebrew Bible, the Bible that modern Jews use in their Old Testament, the book of Ruth comes right after the book of Proverbs. And that may seem, well, what's the big deal with that? Well, it's actually very intentional because that means when you finish reading Proverbs, you will have read Proverbs 31, and then you'll turn the page and you'll read the book of Ruth. And if you know anything about Proverbs 31, you know that it's a well-known chapter because it's known as the chapter about virtuous women, about worthy women. And so, often women are told, read Proverbs 31 and be that kind of woman. And then guys are told, read Proverbs 31 and seek that kind of woman. And so, Proverbs 31 says, "An excellent wife who can find." And that word excellent wife is actually probably not the best translation. It's probably something more like a worthy woman who can find. And that expression, excellent wife or worthy woman, is only said 3 times in the entire Bible. Twice in Proverbs, and then only one other time, and it's in the book of Ruth. And so actually in Ruth chapter 3, it says, "For all my fellow townsmen know," and he's talking about Ruth, "you are a worthy woman." Right? And so in one sense, it makes total sense that Ruth follows Proverbs 31 because who is this excellent woman? Well, Ruth is this excellent kind of woman. And so, yes, women should study it. It's about how to be an excellent woman. It's a woman who loves God and is after his heart. But Ruth, of course, should also be studied by guys. Because Ruth, of course, teaches about biblical manhood and how to be a man of God, how to honor God in your relationships, how to lead properly, lead with integrity, lead with godliness, lead with sacrifice. And so both men, women, we should read Ruth. Although, but you read the story and you're kind of like, but it just, if it was a movie, it's like a chick flick. That's what Ruth is. I always... I'm a visual person. I love watching movies. When I think of Ruth, and I play Ruth, like Meg Ryan is Ruth in my head. If you know, Meg Ryan, she's in all those rom-coms. That's the kind of thing I think of when it comes to Ruth. But I heard one pastor say this, and I think it's so true. He said, so many books in the Old Testament, if they were turned into movies, would be turned into these large, big blockbuster Hollywood type movies. because so many big, outrageous, cosmic things happen in the Old Testament. And it's true, actually, because in the last few years, if you remember, the movie Noah came out with Russell Crowe and Jennifer Connelly. It was an awful movie. Had Hermione Granger in it. I don't know her. What's her name? Emma Watson was in it. And huge blockbuster because you need CGI to create the ark and the waves and all the animals and all that kind of stuff. And then a second really big blockbuster film, if you remember, came out called Exodus, Gods and Kings with Batman in it. Christian Bale was in it. And Sigourney Weaver, Ben Kingsley. And, obviously these movies are big budget blockbuster films, lots of, CGI and powerful signs and wonders. But then you read Ruth and you're like, Ruth has none of that. Nothing, no mountain shaking, no thunder, no clouds. And so Ruth is more like it's an indie film, right? Ruth is one of those films that, you would watch at the Sundance Film Festival or Cannes Film Festival. It's a low budget, plot driven, dialogue driven, just nitty gritty, very ordinary kind of book. And that's the beauty of Ruth, that the characters are so real and they're so relatable. And pretty much you read the book of Ruth and these kinds of experiences could happen in your own lives, that there's really nothing special or spectacular going on in the book of Ruth. There's nothing extraordinary or extravagant happening. And so in that sense, Ruth really does mirror our own lives, a kind of Sunday to Saturday existence, the mundane realities. It's about women who are trying to survive, and they're working the fields, and one's looking for a husband, and they're just, want to have children. And it's just a simple story. And what's really interesting about Ruth is that in our Christian canon, in our Christian ordering, Ruth comes between Judges and 1 Samuel. And it's really interesting that it stands there because on the one hand, you look to the left of Ruth and you have the book of Judges and you have, the strongest man in the Bible. You have Samson, a great character like that. And then you look to the right of Ruth and you have the most favorite man in the Bible, King David. On the left hand in Judges, you have left-handed assassins who are murdering kings while they're taking number twos on the toilet. You have stories of intrigue and covert operations. And then on the right hand side, you have, David fighting Goliaths, and you have prophets or witches conjuring up dead spirits. You have these massive, crazy books, and right in the middle you have Ruth, which is just a story about two women who are trying to survive and make it in the world. They're just ordinary women. And so we're going to look at Ruth over the next 4 meetings, over the next 4 months, and just to let you know this, we call it the book of Ruth, but Ruth is actually about Naomi. And so as you're reading it, I hope you read it at least once through every month. It's called Ruth, but it's actually a story about Naomi. It starts with Naomi and it really does end with Naomi. It's not really about Ruth herself. She's the main character. And you're going to see how that's the case and why that's the case. And so we're going to read Ruth 1, but actually before we do, let me talk about 2 historical realities. I was thinking about how I would teach this, and knowing it's going to be a Bible study and we're going to go deep and we're going to really try to go verse by verse as much as possible. But I figured I should let you know 2 things. So here's what I'm going to tell you: 2 historical realities, and then we're going to read Ruth. You're going to read it on your own. I'll give you some time to read it, to think about it. And I felt like you should know these before you read it because I think it colors some of the story. So here are the 2 things you need to know. The first is you need to know something about the time of the Judges. If you're not aware of the book of Judges, it's about this time in Israel's history. It's the lowest point in Israel's history. So in terms of the nation of Israel, it's a time of spiritual decline, economic decline, political decline, cultural decline. It's the dark ages, the dark period of Israel's history, because there was no king in the land. And historically, what's happened is Moses has led Israel out of slavery in Egypt. They're wandering in the desert. Of course, Moses dies as well as all the first generation Israelites. Joshua becomes the leader. He leads God's people. He leads Israel into the promised land, into Canaan. But God tells them to kill everyone there, to drive them all out. But the people don't, right? Instead, they set up shop right next to the people. They don't drive them out, and so they settle together. They're inhabiting the same land. Eventually, Joshua dies. There's no leader, and something called the Judges cycle begins. And what we see happening in the Judges cycle is really quite simple. Israel sins against God. They start worshiping other gods, sacrificing to other gods, following other religions, and then God judges them by sending a foreign nation, a foreign army who oppresses them. They're oppressed. Woe is me. They cry out to God, we're sorry, we're sorry. God is so merciful. God listens. God raises up a judge, a warrior, to deliver Israel. Israel is delivered. They celebrate, yay, and then they quickly forget. They sin against God, and then God judges them by sending a foreign nation. A foreign nation comes. They oppress Israel. Israel cries out. God, in his mercy, hears. He raises up a judge, delivers them. Israel says, yay. And then they quickly forget. And that's the Judges cycle over and over again. Israel responds not in gratitude, but they respond by sinning again and again and again. And so the book of Judges ends with this really kind of eerie, condemning verse. This is just how the book ends. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes, right? Everyone did what was right in his own eyes, meaning there was no kings, there was no morality. Everyone did whatever they wanted to. And so when you read Ruth 1:1 and it begins in the days when the judges ruled, right? You have to know all of this background. This is the dark ages of Israel's history. So saying in the days when the judges ruled, it's not just a historical chronological marker, it's a theological marker. It's saying this was a really bad time in Israel's history. Now, the second thing you need to know is the Moabites. Who are the Moabites? Now, the Moabites, they have a really checkered past. If you know anything about the origin of the Moabites, it's kind of crazy. In Genesis 19, Abraham and Lot is Abraham's nephew, they separate, right? And Lot heads towards Sodom. And he's in Sodom, and, of course, God delivers Lot and his whole family, and then, his wife looks back, she turns into a pillar of salt. And so Lot is there with his two daughters, but something crazy happens, where they get drunk and they want to continue their, father's line. And so they have this great plan where they're going to, basically, Lot's daughters plan to sleep with him, and he'll get them pregnant and they'll continue. So it actually says in Genesis 19, it says, thus, both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. And so the Moabites, they get their origins from this, disastrous, incestuous scandal of a relationship. Well, not long after this, what you see in the book of Judges, or not the book of Judges, the book of Numbers, is that Israel, they're wandering the desert. They're about to cross over into the promised land. And there's this king named Balak. And Balak, he's the king of Moab. He wants to curse the Israelites. So he hires a prophet named Balaam and says, I'll give you all the gold. I want you to go curse them. And so over and over again, Balaam tries to curse Israel, but he can't. Every time he opens his mouth to curse him, he ends up blessing him. He says, God bless you. He can't stop himself. Just blessings keep coming out. And so, this king of Moab, he fails in his plan, but what happens right after is really interesting. In Numbers 25, this is talking about the Israelites. It says the people, that's the Israelites, began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. And so it's interesting, although the king of Moab, Balak, can't get Balaam to curse Israel, what ends up happening is the Moabite women, they start tempting and luring, seducing these Israelite men. And they do so, and the Israelite men, they begin sacrificing and following after these false gods. So, okay, that's strike 2 against the Moabites. The Moabites are really, really bad people. Strike 3 against the Moabites is, in the book of Judges, you learn this. And the people served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. And so actually what we see in the book of Judges is that Israel was enslaved under the Moabites, and the Moabites oppressed them for 18 years. And so basically when you get to Ruth and you read the story that there's this family that sojourned to Moab, you're supposed to go, right, you're supposed to gasp. We go, okay, what the heck is Moab? We don't, why does that matter anyway? But you're supposed to gasp, right? It's like this family, who lived in Seoul. They moved to North Korea, and you're like, what? Why would you do that? Or, you're an Eagles fan and you're Philadelphia native born, and then you move to Dallas, and you're like, why would you move to Dallas? And so you're supposed to read Moab. You're supposed to be offended. You're supposed to actually be kind of like irritated, upset, disgusted a little bit. And those are the two things. Okay, so if you have a Bible, turn to Ruth chapter 1. I don't have it here on the screen, and so because I wanted you to either look at it on your phone, or there should be a Bible under you if you want to look at a hardback Bible. And so with those two things in mind, the time of the judges and who the Moabites are, we're going to read this, or I'm going to ask you to read it by yourself. Now, as you read it, don't read it like one of Paul's letters, right? Don't try to glean and learn from the story through a series of propositions. Remember, it's a story. And just like in any good English class, literature class, you're supposed to enter the story, right? Try to sympathize with the characters. Pay attention to the dynamics. Pay attention to dialogue. Put yourself in their shoes. Try to get inside the story. And so let's read Ruth chapter 1. We're not going to read it together. I'm just going to give you 5 minutes or so to read the story. I hope you already read chapter 1, but you can read it again and get inside the story for a bit. And so let's just take a few moments and read that. Okay, I just want to let you know that was about 3.5 minutes and you read a chapter. So this means you can read the Bible every single day because it only takes 3.5 minutes. So that was a trick. No, it wasn't, but I hope you had time to read the story. So we're gonna begin, and of course you can stop and ask questions. But I'm gonna do something I don't normally do. I'm gonna pretty much go verse by verse. There will be a couple sections where I'll group the verses together. I do encourage you to, if you want to take notes and to do that. But let's begin. Okay, so Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Okay, so it's in the days of the judges. It's the lowest point in Israel's history, and not only is it the worst time in Israel's history, the worst thing that can happen in an agrarian society happens, and there's a famine, right? And so in the famine, where you're going to find out is this famine represents 2 things. One, it's a physical, literal famine. There's literally no bread. But it also indicates, that the time of Israel, there was a spiritual, emotional famine, right? That the famine and emptiness and barrenness is so much more than just a physical bread, but there's a kind of spiritual, emotional emptiness in this story. And so we're told about 4 people, but you don't know their names yet, right? They're all nameless. You're told that there's a man, there's his wife, there's his 2 sons, but you're not told their names. Instead, what you're told is where they're from, right? And so it's highlighted that they are from Bethlehem in Judah. Just really quickly, Bethlehem, does anyone know what Bethlehem means? Bethlehem means the house of bread, right? Sorry. Bethlehem means the house of bread. And so, just really quick Hebrew lesson for you all. Beth, B-E-T-H, is Hebrew for house. Lahem is Hebrew for bread. Bethlehem. Now, I hope that sounds familiar. If you've ever driven on a road and you see a synagogue, its name will usually be something like Beth something, right? Next time notice, it'll be like Beth Or, right? Beth Or means house of light. Or Beth Olam means house forever. Beth El is God, house of God. So Bethlehem, the house of bread. And that's really important that the author is highlighting that because he wants you to notice the irony. During the famine, when there is no more bread, the family has to leave the house of bread. Right? There's no bread in the house of bread. But also by telling us that they're from Bethlehem, we know they're Israelites. And so not only, are this Israelite family is leaving Bethlehem, but it says they go to the country of Moab, and you're supposed to read Moab and go, oh, that's a big no-no, right? That's not where they're supposed to go. Because what they're doing is they're leaving the promised land, right? They're leaving the land that God has promised to give to them in order to go to this foreign nation. But it makes sense because whoever this man is, he's just human after all, right? He just wants to be a good husband. He wants to be a good father. He's just looking out for his family. They're hungry. He wants to keep them alive at all costs. And so he does what any good dad would do. He says, okay, let's go. Let's go where there's food. So he has a plan, and it says here, to sojourn in the country of Moab, to visit, to stop by. He doesn't want to go there, but he knows there's no choice, and it's okay. It'll just be for a little bit, right? So that's his dad brain thinking, okay, I gotta keep my family alive. So even though we shouldn't go there, we're going to at least stop by. We need to eat. Okay. Verse 2, the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. So now we're told their names, right? So before we're told their names, what's most important is that they're Israelites, and it's a no-no because they're going to Moab. He's saying, okay, now that you know that, let me tell you about them. Elimelech comes from two words. It's more Hebrew. Eli Melech. Eli means my God, because El means God. So Eli, my God, and then Melech means king. And already you can begin to apply your Hebrew. Have you ever seen in the Bible another place where it says Eli? Well, there's Elijah, right? My God is Yahweh. Yeah. Jesus on the cross says, well, you could say it in different ways, but Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, right? What is he saying? My God, Eli, my God, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. Why have you forsaken me? And so, Eli, my God, and Melech means king. And so you may know about this priest in Genesis, and he also appears in Hebrews, very mysterious kind of guy. He lives in the shadows. You don't know much about him. His name is Melchizedek, right? The Melchi is the Melech. It means king of righteousness. Melchizedek, and Zedek means righteousness. So like Zedekiah means the Lord is righteous. So anytime you see a Zedek, think righteousness. Anytime you see a Melek, think king. So you have a guy named My God is King. He's married to a woman named Naomi, and that means pleasant. Her name is Pleasant. And then they have two sons. And it's a blessing, of course, in the ancient culture to have two boys, right? Twins is even easier. 3 is an incredible blessing, although it's a headache, I'm sure, for mothers. They have two boys, Mahlon and Chilion. And so, Father, my God is King, Mother, Pleasant. And they have two sons, and their names are Mahlon and Chilion, which mean sick and dying. Their names mean sick and frail, which are odd names. Why would you name your kid that? And so I heard a pastor say, it's like naming your kids pneumonia and bronchitis. Like, why would you do that? We don't know. Maybe they were born and they were just sick kids. So far we have like bad news. Time of Judges, bad. Famine in the land, bad. Go to Moab, bad. Kids are sick and frail, or sick and dying, bad. But really, the worst part is right here at the end where it says, they went into the country of Moab, and this is the worst part. They remained there, right? They had the best intention. They were going to sojourn there. They're going to stop by while there was food, but they ended up making their lives there. And we find out later that they're going to be there 10 years, right? And so it wasn't a brief, stop by. They end up living their lives there, which kind of makes me think, we do everything with the best intentions, but sometimes the consequences of our decisions are never what we imagined, and we have to live with those mistakes because everything bad that happens in their lives is going to come as a result of these two words. They remained there. So we go to verse 3. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her two sons. And so the story just gets worse and worse. More bad news, right? How low can this valley descend? Because it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And the answer, of course, how low can the valley descend? The answer is lower still. Now consider the irony of this. Elimelech moved his family to Bethlehem in order to escape, or moved them out of Bethlehem to Moab in order to escape death and find life in Moab. But all he finds in Moab is his own death. And so the irony there, I'm trying to run away from death, and you run to Moab, you find death. But of course, there's still a glimmer of hope. Because yes, her husband has passed away, but she has two sons, right? She's a widow, but she has two strong, capable sons. They may be sick and frail, but they're still boys, right? They can still provide. They can still protect her. But they took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. And so the glimmer of hope shines for about 1 second before you read what kind of wives that they take, Moabite wives. And remember in Numbers 25, the last time Israelite guys, went steady with Moabite women, bad things happened, right? If you actually read Numbers 25, God gets so mad, he says, take all those men out and I want you to hang them out in the sun, right? It's very violent, very, very not good things happen. And so these sons, they marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, and they're there for 10 years. And what's really interesting is there's no mention of children, right? So they're married for 10 years and they don't have kids, meaning Orpah and Ruth were barren, right? Which is more bad news. And you have to remember this, like in the ancient times, I just learned this term. You guys know the term, dinks, right? Double income, no kids. I just learned what somebody taught me. I think Sarah Jennison taught me that. But, in ancient times, there were no dinks, right? No double income, no kids. This is like the goal of, like couples today. And it's like, oh, let's marry and then for a couple years not have kids and, have fun and enjoy life. And then, we can have kids later. But they didn't have that luxury and that wasn't the way they thought back in the ancient days, right? They got married and they got married because they wanted to have kids, right? And they wanted more farmhands and they wanted more status and protection in society. And so they want to have kids, but they can't have kids. 10 years, no kids, so they must be barren. So not only is the land of Bethlehem barren of food, but Naomi's daughters-in-law are barren of children, right? And so you see that the famine is so much more than just lack of bread. Well, and Mahlon and Chilion died so that the woman was left without her two sons and her husband. And some of you know this in life. When it rains, they say it pours. And for Naomi, when it rains, it also floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, and tsunamis all at the same time, right? Like I've had bad days before. I've had bad weeks, but Naomi's having a bad decade, right? Her life is horrible in so many ways because she's losing everything, right? So not only is there sadness in losing your husband, but no parent should have to bury a child. And on top of that, no parent should have to bury both of their children. And no widow should have to bury both of their children or all of their children. And, Naomi, escaped, left Bethlehem to come to Moab in order to find life. But all she is finding is death. Death is waiting for her in Moab. And at this point, you can just imagine that she's looking back over the past 10 years and regretting every single decision she has ever made because it's led her to this point. And she's left not only without any grandchildren, but no grandsons. And she's beginning to see that her family line is ending, right? There's really no hope left for her. Her line ends with her, and she's looking into the future, and all she sees is a period, right? The story ends with her. And I was trying to think about that and the type of sadness there is. And the closest I could get is, sometimes I think about how I don't know any Korean, or I know so little Korean that I could never pass it down to anybody. And I think, man, I got really sad over this once when I was thinking, there's no way I'm going to be able to teach my kid Korean, and that language is going to die with me. No Kims after me are going to know anything about how to say anything in Korean. And I was thinking about that, and it got me really sad. And I'm just like, not if I marry a Korean-speaking person. That's true. I'm thinking Naomi is looking into her future and no grandchildren, and she knows that her land, her generation, her line is going to end with her. But not only that, because it's ancient times, if you don't have a husband and you don't have children, you don't have rights. You have no social standing. And so she's a nobody in society now. And then add to that, it's the time of the judges. And if you remember, so the time of the judges, there's no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So people stole, right? People raped concubines. People chopped bodies up. And everything that happens in the book of Judges that's utterly disturbing and disgusting, that's the time of the judges. And so here's a woman with no children, no husband, in the time of the judges by herself in a foreign land, completely vulnerable. It was such a dangerous time. And I have a professor at Westminster who lectured on this once, and I couldn't fact check them on this, but I'll take his word for it. He said there was a poll done once, and this hypothetical situation was posed to two groups of men. The first group of men were American men, and the poll basically went something like this. The hypothetical situation was, your mother, your wife, and your daughter are all in a sinking boat, and you can rescue only one of them. Who do you rescue? Right? So your mother, your wife, and your daughter. And in this poll of American men, 60% said they would rescue their daughter. 40% said they would rescue their wives. Right, you don't have to be amazing at math to realize that means 0% left over for mothers. All of them said they would let their mothers, go adrift. Now, that same hypothetical situation was posed to Saudi men, right? Men from Saudi Arabia. And 100% of them said that they would save their mother. And this is because in traditional cultures, especially in the Near East, mothers have no identity outside of their home, right? They're that reliant on their sons. Of course, in that culture, daughters are the ones who leave their family and they join the sons, but they remain at home. A son is a mother's life. And that's the kind of relationship. And so you can imagine then, even more so, Naomi losing her husband and her sons was so utterly devastating for her. And so, kind of at this point in the story, just by verse 5, you got to really stop. And in order to feel the emotion of this, right? It's not like Paul's letters where you're just like, okay, what's the point and what's the argument and where are you leading up to? Like literature is meant for you to stop and just pause and really try to get into the story, right? Feeling Naomi's pain and her loneliness and her suffering and her fear. You need to feel the wetness of her tears dropping on you, and you need to hear the trembling in her voice, and you need to feel the quaking of her body. And so there was a famine in the land of Bethlehem, but there's a greater famine. There's a famine in Naomi's life. She is empty. She is barren. All hope is lost. And what's really interesting is Naomi in the Israelite mind at this point is pretty much dead. You see, in the Western world, the way we think is like living is a matter of breathing or not breathing, right? Like we think of it biologically, like, oh, check a pulse, he's alive. Oh, no pulse, he's dead. We draw that sharp line. But in the Hebrew ancient Israelite mindset, life and death were more in gradations, right? And so, we can kind of get close to it. Like we'll say, you've heard the expression like, oh man, you haven't had, this type of food, or you haven't seen this, you haven't lived yet, right? And of course, we obviously don't mean they really haven't lived, but we mean like you haven't lived life in its fullest, right? In the same kind of way, the Israelites, the way they thought about life and death was like, you're fully alive when you're walking with God and you're in Jerusalem and you're with the temple and you're offering the sacrifices. But actually, when you move outside of the promised land, right, you are actually partially dead. So when Israel is exiled, right, that's why the exile is such a big deal, because they are away from the promised land. It's a partial death. But the greatest death that one could suffer is having no husband and no sons. It meant your life was over. You're breathing, but you're not living. And that's Naomi's situation. Because at this point, she doesn't have a means to live because she doesn't have a husband and a wife. And she really doesn't have any reason to live because she doesn't have a husband and a wife. So verse 6, then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. Now, if you read the whole book of Ruth, what's really interesting is the Lord's name, he's going to show up a few times, the name, but God, in terms of intervening into the story, is only going to appear twice. This is one of them, and the second time is in Ruth chapter 4, verse 13, where it says that God gave, I think I wrote it here somewhere. What does it say? It says the Lord gave Ruth conception, right? And so those are the only two times God shows up. At the beginning, when he comes and he brings bread, and at the very end, when he allows Ruth to have a baby. They'll say, the Lord be with you and also with you, Ruth 2:4, when Boaz says it. So there's a word here that's actually a really important part of the story. It's the word return. Naomi arose to return from Moab back to Bethlehem. And first, the word return is really important because it's the same word for repent. The Hebrew word is shuv. So when Israel repents, they shuv. But also when Naomi returns back to Moab, she shuvs. And so there's this repetition of the use of the word shuv. I'm gonna skip that. But can someone, Hyun, can you read this? I'm just kidding. It's intentionally meant to be small. The only thing I want you to notice is all the blue, right? I just intentionally did that so you can kind of see. All the blue is 12 times between verses 6 to 22. 12 times the Hebrew word shuv is used, meaning that a large part of the huge theme of this chapter is this idea of returning and repenting, right? Because think about what has happened so far in this story. They've left the promised land. The land God has promised, they've left. And so now when they realize that going away from God means death, now Naomi's coming to her senses and she's returning, right? And it's here it says that we find out that God had visited his people and given them food, right? He's returned to the house of bread and given them bread, and now they return, which is actually very similar to the prodigal son story. Remember this? But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father. I will return, and I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. And so Naomi, in one sense, is returning. She's repenting and coming back to the Lord. She's experienced death away from him, and she will come back to him, right? And God, of course, shows up. He provides. He is faithful to his covenant. All right, verses 7 to 9. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each one of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each one of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. Right, so at this point, Naomi understands the bleakness of her situation, and she's encouraging her daughters-in-law, hey, go back home. There's nothing here for you. Now, there's a really important word used here. I know it's kind of small, but I tried to bold it. That word deal kindly is probably not a good translation. The actual Hebrew word used here is the word hesed. You guys may have heard that word before. It's not hesed. It's more like chesed, right? So you can practice that at home. Chesed. And it's translated here as deal kindly. And other times in the Bible, you'll see it translated as like steadfast love or steadfast faithfulness or covenant loyalty. Sarah Lloyd-Jones, she wrote a book called the Jesus Storybook Bible, and she translates chesed like this. I love it. It's the never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. Right? So she's saying, may God show to you, Ruth and Orpah, God's never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever kind of love. And so in the Bible, God's love is a chesed kind of love. And, Paul Miller, he wrote a book and he writes this thing I just wanted to share with you. He says, chesed is one-way love, right? Not two-way love, it's one-way love. Love without an exit strategy. When you love with chesed love, I'm going to stop saying that. When you love with chesed love, you bind yourself to the object of your love, no matter what the response is. So if the object of your love snaps at you, you still love that person. If you've had an argument with your spouse in which you were slighted or not heard, you refuse to retaliate through silence or withholding your affections. Your response to the other person is entirely independent of how that person has treated you. Hesed is a stubborn love, right? It's a beautiful picture of what kind of love God's love is. And we obviously live in 2020 in an age where we don't prize, we don't cherish a Hesed kind of love. We live in an age where you love, and that love is based on feelings and emotions, not on commitment. I won't lie, even as a kid, when my parents said love is not emotion, it's commitment, I was like, well, that's because you guys don't love each other. And, you don't understand what love is. And I've come to realize they do. I don't understand what it is. And then Paul Miller, I don't have the quote up here, but he goes on to say, every good feeling becomes a new path. So we become good at starting to love, but bad at finishing. Soon we are lost and alone in a maze of relationships. And so if love is just a feeling, then yeah, it's really easy to love. I'm great at starting love. If it's a commitment, I'm bad at finishing love. So in this story, you have Ruth and you have Orpah, and they show Hesed love to Naomi, right? Because it says here, go return, each one of you, to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me, as you have shown me Hesed kind of love. And so she's telling them, go home. I don't want to be a burden on you, right? She's not saying go home because you're a burden on me. She says, I don't want to be a burden to you. And at this point, the only thing Naomi has left are her two daughter-in-laws, right? That's the only family she has left. And yet she's saying, even you, I'm willing to give up. I'm willing to die a little more. I'm going to sacrifice what little I have so that your life can improve. And so, in fact, although she's saying, Ruth and Orpah, you've shown me Hesed love, she's showing Hesed love to them, right? She's saying, I'm willing to take the hit. And in order for your life to flourish, I'm willing for my life to crumble even some more. And she's willing to give them hope and ensure that they have a future by giving up whatever hope and whatever future that she may possibly have. And by giving them up, she's giving herself over to certain death so that they might have a reason to live. And she's saying, I can't change my life, but I can certainly help you improve yours. And she releases them. And I think right there, we need to stop as we think about Ruth and just, it's like, how could we not stop and reflect on this greater Hesed love, right? The anticipation of another person who will come and have a Hesed love to us, where he basically says, you know what, I'm going to take on death so that you can have life, right? I'm going to take the hit so that you can flourish. And of course, Jesus comes and he takes our sin and he takes our death so that we might have righteousness and we might have life in his name. So this Hesed love, this God's love, is shown to us most clearly in Jesus. I know it's kind of small here, but reading verses 10 to 13. And they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Now, Naomi here brings up something really interesting. It's called levirate marriage. And levirate marriage, it's called levirate marriage. Levir is Hebrew for brother-in-law. So levirate marriage is a brother-in-law marriage. And basically, she's referring to this principle in Deuteronomy, and this is what it says in chapter 25. If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in to her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out in Israel. And it's basically saying that if a son is married and the son dies and doesn't have children, then that wife should marry the next brother in line, right? Provided he doesn't have his own wife. And the whole point was that you ensure that the name of the family continues and that the family property, right, stays within the family. And so Naomi is a realist. She's basically saying, first of all, I'm like way too old to get married. And even if I did get married, like I can't have children, but let's say miraculously I have children. Like I have to have two at the same, I have to have twins. And then even then, like you guys, if you have to wait till they grow up, then you're going to be too old to have children. So by the time they can get old enough to father children, you're going to be too old to have children. And so this is pointless. And so Naomi isn't being cynical here when she says this. She's not being pessimistic. She's like, just look at the facts, right? You still have a full life ahead of you. I don't. So let's cut our losses here. And so Naomi is a realist. Well, then, at the very end, she has this little line, and we've read it, but I just want to focus on it because it doesn't sound right to us. She says, "No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." And here Naomi starts lamenting, right? And this is really important because this is giving us an indication, like, how is Naomi, like, experiencing all of her life? Like, what's the lens by which she's interpreting her life and everything she's experienced? And this is it. She's saying, my life is bitter. God's hand has come out against me. Right? And basically she's saying, it feels like God's hand is actively at work against me. All right? God's hand is actively opposing me. God is making things more difficult and tougher for me. And she uses this really interesting expression. She says, the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. And if you remember, if you've read the Old Testament before, the hand of the Lord particularly comes up a lot in the book of Exodus. Because whenever Moses, on behalf of God, is striking Israel with the plague, it says, like, the hand of the Lord came against them. Right? And so pretty much whenever the hand of the Lord gets involved, really bad stuff happens. Because the hand of the Lord is a hand of judgment. It's a hand that, big chaotic things begin happening. And here Naomi is saying, look at all this suffering. God's hand is against me. And my question, is like, what's your knee-jerk reaction to that? Is she allowed to say that? Because, for some of us who know and have theology, we don't do good at interpreting or hearing things like this. I know I don't. My knee-jerk reaction in talking to somebody, as soon as they say, I feel like God's hand is against me, it's like, like all these, like, don't you know Genesis, 50, where it says, that you meant this for harm, but God meant it for good. And don't you know Romans 8 and, how all things work together for good. And you guys know, like, you have these set memorized verses because we think, if you know theology, then you'll never lament, right? How can you say that? Don't you know God is up to something good? And often we want to dismiss lament. We want to dismiss sorrow. We want to dismiss suffering because we have a sovereign God. But it's actually the other way. I think if you actually know theology and you actually know your Bible, then you know it's legitimate to lament and cry out and complain to God. Right? So many of the Psalms teach us how to lament. And Christians need to learn the art of lamenting, right? My question just for you is you kind of think about it is like, how good are you at lamenting? And I think a lot of us, maybe we feel like God doesn't want to hear our laments, that God doesn't welcome our complaints, and so we feel bad about it. But you look at like the book of Psalms, and the book of Psalms is 150 chapters, and basically 1/3 of the book of Psalms are just laments. They're Psalms of laments. And so, why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? Or Psalm 13, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? Psalm 35, how long, O Lord, will you look on? Rescue me from their destruction, my precious life from the lions. Even what Jesus cries out on the cross, Psalm 22, that's a psalm of lament. Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And something in us, I feel like, whenever our brokenness feels unbalanced, or whenever we see somebody else's brokenness and they feel like unbalanced, we want to like correct them. We want to like set them right? If they're tilting, we want to like put you back in the right place. But Naomi is right here to repent. Like God actually gives us the Psalms to say, all right, I'm going to let you complain and I'm going to let you cry out. I'm going to let you cry. And here's how you should do it. And so it's not like God is saying to us, hey, get over it and then come to me because I only want you to come to me when you're happy and when things are going well. But God's saying, oh, you're sad? Don't run away from me. Come to me with your sadness. Come to me with your sorrow. Come to me with your brokenness. And so I think, we need to learn how to lament. We need to be able to cry out and say, God, I honestly feel like your hand is against me. And God is okay with that. So she says this to her daughters-in-law, and they respond by lifting up their voices and weeping again. And Orpah kisses her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And this is really interesting. So Orpah she hears Naomi's logic, and she leaves, right? She's the logical one. And sometimes when we read the story, I don't know about you, but when I was younger, I used to say Ruth was my favorite book of the Bible, and I think it still is, but I would always read Ruth or read the story and look at Orpah and think Orpah was wrong for what she did, right? Like, Orpah, she's cold-hearted, she's unloving. But that's not how the story actually wants you to see her, because there's no words of criticism against her, right? Orpah isn't condemned for anything that she did. In fact, Orpah, they're trying to show like Orpah's response is right and it's logical. So she's not in the story for her to look bad. She's in the story to help Ruth look even better. Right? That's the purpose. And so Orpah is not condemned for leaving. Ruth is praised for staying. And, it's not like Orpah did the unexpected thing. She did the expected thing. This is what you should do. You should leave. It's Ruth who does the unexpected thing. But of course, Ruth doesn't just stay. She covenants. And there's this word, she clings, right? Ruth clung to her. And that word clung to her is a very important word because it's the same word used in Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 2, right after God creates Adam and Eve, and he institutes marriage for the first time, it says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And that word hold fast is the word cling, right? And the old, I think King James would say cleave, right? You leave and you cleave, you cling to. And so the clinging, the way Ruth is clinging to Naomi is the way that husband and wife are called to cling to one another. It's covenantal language here. And so Ruth's actions, they speak volumes. Because basically when she clings and she covenants, so my friend has this hilarious story that he went to seminary with me, and he went to NYU for a couple of years, and it was like super expensive, and he was like, "This is so expensive." So he stopped going. He went to a Christian school, graduated, then went to Westminster. Anyway, he graduated with just a ton of debt, and then he got married to a nurse who was single for so long and worked tons of overtime and lived with their parents and had saved a ton of money, and then they got married. And he sat down and he was like, "Okay, so what are we going to do about our debt?" And she was like, "Your debt." He's like, "No, we're one flesh now, our debt." Because when you get married, what happens, right? Your debt becomes their debt. It all comes together. And so when Ruth is clinging to Naomi, what's she saying? She's saying like all your baggage and your loneliness and your hopelessness and your suffering, all of that is mine as well, right? Your hopelessness is no longer just yours, it's mine. Your loneliness is not just yours, it's mine. And this is Hesed love, right? A clinging kind of love saying like, hey, I see the valley that's up ahead. I know exactly what I'm walking into, and I'm not going to leave your side. And that's the difference because Orpah makes her decision based on sight, but Ruth makes her decision based on faith. And it's almost kind of silly and crazy for Ruth to do this because she has nothing to gain, right? If she follows Naomi back, she's going back. She's a Moabite foreigner who's barren, right? And she's not the most ideal bachelorette. She's not going to go to Bethlehem and the fields are going to, all the men are going to come. She is not the greatest catch in that sense, right? I mean, if they had like a Bethlehem bachelor, right? She wouldn't make it past round one because they would look at her and be like, "What? You're a Moabite? You're barren? I don't want you." And yet, even though she has very little chance of being pursued, she's not a good candidate, Ruth clings because she shows God's Hesed love to Naomi. And in that sense, Ruth is actually God's answer to Naomi's lament. Because you have to think of, so what happened right before Ruth clings to her? Naomi says, "God's hand is against me." She's saying that God's hand is against me. And then Ruth with her hands clings to her. And Ruth is saying, no, God's hands are on you. And so in that kind of way, Ruth is actually being used as God's face to Naomi. Right? Ruth is God's visible expression of love to somebody who feels unloved. And I think that's important for us to learn. I mean, both in marriage, but in all relationships. Of course, Jesus is most clearly God's love to us, but that means all of us have an opportunity in the way that we Hesed love others, that God can use us to show his love to another person. Right? That when you smile at another person, God could use you to show God's smile to another person. To show his love to your spouse, to your parents, to your children, to your friends, to your neighbors, right? Well, the story continues in verse 15. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." So Naomi starts using peer pressure. Look, all the cool people are going back home. Why don't you be like her? And then she gives a command, return, do it, I'm telling you. But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And this... verse 16, but Ruth, right? Ruth isn't swayed. Naomi's saying, go, I want you to go. Ruth's saying, you know what, I'm going to cling even harder because this is covenant faithfulness. And then she says this beautiful poem. It's actually a poem. And you can kind of note the parallels. There's 3 stanzas. Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. So this first pledge is a pledge to Naomi. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Then there's a second pledge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Right? And this is the pledge to Naomi's world. Right? Who your people are will be my people. Who your God is will be my God. And then this third part seems unnecessary. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. And it's kind of like, well, why would you say that? Because you can covenant to Naomi, and then once Naomi dies, then you go back home. But she's saying, even when you die, right, because Naomi's older, she's presumably going to die before Ruth. She's saying, even when you die, I'm going to keep living in the land, and I'm going to die there. It's like, why would you do that? Right? You should have thought it through a little bit more. But this is really important, because what Ruth is actually saying is something like this. She's saying, okay, your people are going to be my people. Your God is going to be my God. So she's saying, I'm a follower of Yahweh, right? I'm going to love and follow Yahweh. But if Naomi dies and then Ruth goes back to Moab, she's not only going back to Moab, she's going back to her gods. Meaning that Yahweh was never her God, right? And so this third pledge actually substantiates the second one. So by saying your God is my God, she's saying, and I'm absolutely committed to your God being my God. So even when you die, I'm going to stay in the land. I'm going to stay in God's land because I'm going to follow after God. And this is so important because what ends up happening is then this is not really even a pledge to Naomi. This is more a pledge to God. Right? That at the middle of this, at the heart of Ruth's covenant is not love for Naomi, it's love for God. And I think this is the shape that Hesed love needs to take. God always needs to stand at the center of our love for others. Right? It's only faithfulness and commitment toward God that will empower faithfulness and commitment and love toward others. Which means in relationships, we cannot love by our own strength and our own affections and our own emotions. We hear it, and it's often so cliche, but like God's love needs to stand at the center of it, because your commitment to another person, your love to another person cannot come from yourself. It must be drawn from love and faithfulness and commitment to the Lord. And so then Ruth says to her, I'm going to stick with you, even though I receive no benefit from this. And from a human sense, this really makes no sense at all, because Ruth is leaving her home and her comfort and everything she knows to follow after Naomi, who can offer her nothing, right? And that's just illogical. But the whole point of this covenant is to help us see that she is pointing to another kind of love. And you read this and it's like, man, one, I want to love like Ruth loves, right? And I want to be loved like Naomi is loved. And the whole point of the story is to say, hey, you reader, you are loved like Naomi is loved. Because there's another person who left his home and left his comfort and left everything he had to come and do something for you when it was of no benefit for him. And of course, you hear Jesus Christ saying, if being with you means death for me, then death it is for me. Right? The book of Ruth helps us understand that we are loved in this kind of covenantal way, that in the bitterest of moments, in all of our sufferings and all of our baggage, because we are Naomi in the story, there is one who covenants, who pledges himself to love us in this kind of way. And that is the love of Jesus Christ. Well, we're going to wrap up here soon. In verse 18, and when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? So Naomi, she stops running away from this kind of love. At this point, she probably feels unlovable. I don't know if you've ever felt unlovable. She probably feels unlovable. She's refusing it. She finally says, all right, I give in. I'll receive it. I may not feel worthy of, but I'll accept your love and your commitment, Ruth. And so they quietly make their way back to Bethlehem, right? 2 widows dressed in black leading into town. The way they say it is, Bethlehem was a medium-sized city, and so there would have only been one gate, right? Everything had to happen through the gate. And we know that because later, when the kinsman redeemer situation is happening, they meet at the gate, the elders at the gate. So there's one gate, and so, they can't sneak in, right? So they're coming back, and everybody sees them. And it says here that the town was stirred. The better translation is like, there was an echo of excitement. Is that Naomi? We haven't seen her in years, but they're probably thinking, who's that with her? And where's her husband? And where are her 2 kids? And Naomi, who left the town with everything, is returning with nothing. She returns with absolutely nothing, and it kind of begins to bother her because, when people are talking about you, right? You could kind of tell. Everyone is talking about Naomi, right? Is this Naomi? Is this Naomi? She knows she's the subject of everyone's gossip. But what's really bothering her is probably this. What does Naomi mean? It means pleasant, right? And so she's entering into town with Ruth, who's a reminder that she's lost everything. And she's walking in, and she's sad, and she's bitter, and she's lamenting. And everyone is saying, isn't that Miss Pleasant? Isn't that Miss Pleasant? Right? And every time somebody says her name, she's reminded that her life has taken a different turn than she expected, that her life is everything but pleasant. And so she's had enough, and she snaps. She said to them, do not call me Naomi. Do not call me pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. Call me Mara. Call me bitter, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full. The Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? And Naomi says, you know what? I have a better name. Bitter is a better name. And she summarizes the whole chapter. The whole chapter is verse 21. I went away full. The Lord has brought me back empty. She says, I'm so bitter and I'm so empty. But what we know, if you keep reading the rest of the story, is that the Lord brought her back bitter and empty so that he could then fill her life with sweetness. That's where the story is headed. And God is, of course, orchestrating something great out of this. And he's doing that in your life too. If there's bitterness and emptiness in your life, the Lord is doing that so he could fill you. He could fill that emptiness and replace the bitterness with the sweetness. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. And the chapter ends the way that it started. Remember, the chapter before you even got to their names mentioned Moab and Bethlehem, right? That was first before any of the names. Well, this chapter ends with Moab and Bethlehem, except now there's a major difference. One huge difference between the way the chapter starts and the way the chapter begins. Because when the chapter starts with famine. And when the chapter ends, it ends with a harvest. And so what's the point in all this? The chapter's ending with great hope, right? That when Naomi seemed to feel like she had everything, there was actually a famine. And when Naomi seems to have nothing, there's actually a harvest. And why? Because sometimes, God, in order to reap the fruit in our lives, he will sow those into seeds of famine. And we may not understand what he's doing, but he is up to something good. And we know the whole story. The harvest, it ends intentionally with the word harvest to show that there is still hope. And just like God ended the famine in Bethlehem by bringing fullness back into the land, so he's going to end the famine of Naomi's life by bringing fullness back into her life. And so the chapter, it ends brilliantly, right? With this bright, shining light of hope. Right? In the midst of the darkness, in the days of the judges, there was a famine in the land. But an ending, in Bethlehem, now there's a barley harvest beginning. And so just as hope is held out for Naomi in the story, the hope is held out for us. And so thus ends Ruth chapter 1. That was only an hour and 5 minutes. Thank you guys for listening. And what I wanted to do now, it's just to break up, and this is such a rich chapter.